He always stayed late, not for the deadlines, but for the silence. But one night, he wasn't the only one left behind, and what started as quiet glances turned into something neither of them could explain. In an empty office, two men found something they didn't know they were searching for. The office was silent, long past the hour when most had packed up and gone home. Only the hum of machines and the soft flicker of monitors remained, casting faint glows onto vacant desks. Outside, the city lights blinked through rain-speckled windows, reflections shimmering like distant stars. Eli sat alone at his desk, fingers hovering above the keyboard, though the code on his screen had long since stopped making sense. It wasn't uncommon for him to stay late. The quiet brought clarity. Without chatter or deadlines breathing down his neck, the code felt purer, almost like a language only he could speak. But tonight, something was different. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. A low vibration in the silence that he couldn't quite name. Across the floor, the glow of another monitor caught his eye. One of the far cubicles, usually dark by 6, still flickered with life. At first, he thought it was the janitorial staff. But then he saw movement, shoulders hunched slightly, head tilted as if studying something carefully. Noah. He'd only joined the team 2 months ago, but Eli had noticed him immediately. It wasn't just the confident walk or the sharp way he dressed in soft grays and navy knits. It was his presence. The way he spoke in meetings, clear, grounded, unintimidated. Eli had admired that from a distance, never daring to step closer. The cursor on his screen blinked. He blinked back. Why was Noah still here? Eli stood, stretched his tired limbs, and slowly walked toward the kitchenette, the low click of his shoes the only sound breaking the stillness. The automatic lights flickered on above him. He reached for a mug and filled it with warm water from the dispenser, watching the steam curl upward like smoke. As he turned to leave, he heard it. Another pair of footsteps. Noah stepped into view. His expression relaxed, perhaps surprised to see someone else here so late, but not uncomfortable. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked to the sink, rinsed out his water bottle, then leaned casually against the counter. For a long moment, they just stood there, not speaking, not moving, just coexisting in the quiet. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't charged, but it was something. Eli focused on his mug, both hands wrapped tightly around it. His mind felt cluttered with questions he wouldn't ask. He wasn't good at small talk. He wasn't good at any talk, really, not outside of code. But being near Noah didn't feel demanding. It felt oddly peaceful. Eventually, Noah offered a faint smile, nodded once in acknowledgement, and turned back toward his side of the office. His presence lingered long after he disappeared. Eli returned to his desk, but the code still refused to cooperate. Instead, he sat in silence, sipping warm water and watching the city. Somewhere behind him, Noah continued to work, his keystrokes slow and deliberate. There was something comforting about the rhythm. Midnight came and went. The building creaked softly as it settled, like an old house shifting its weight. Eli pulled his sweater tighter around himself and stared into the blue light of his monitor. He thought about how often he'd stayed late to avoid going home to his silent apartment, how the soft glow of his screen had become more familiar than a face in a mirror, and how odd it was that tonight, in this same solitude, he didn't feel entirely alone. He didn't look for reasons. He didn't need to. Some connections didn't arrive with explanations. They arrived in presence, in shared silence, in the unspoken comfort of knowing someone else was still there. By 1 a.m., the floor was colder. The thermostat had gone into night mode, and Eli rubbed his hands together absently. He glanced again toward the distant cubicle. Still occupied, still quiet. He wondered what Noah was working on. A sprint ticket? A personal project? Or maybe, like Eli, he just didn't want to go home. That thought settled in his chest like a stone. When Eli finally packed up his laptop, the building had grown impossibly still. He walked toward the elevator slowly, every step echoing through the empty halls. As he pressed the button, he looked back one last time. Noah was still there, a dim silhouette against the soft glow of the screen. He hadn't moved, and maybe that meant nothing, or maybe it meant everything. The elevator chimed. Eli stepped inside and let the doors close without another glance. But even as the floor numbers ticked down, and even as the night swallowed the last lights of the office, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't dread coming back. The next evening unfolded almost exactly like the one before. Eli stayed behind again, not out of obligation, but because something within him was restless, curious. The office emptied gradually, voices fading, chairs scraping, lights flickering off one by one. Yet as the silence settled in, that familiar glow still burned across the room. Noah was here again. Eli kept his eyes on his screen, but the code blurred together. He wasn't working. He was waiting. Not for anything specific. Not for a sign. Just for the air to shift again like it had the night before. For something unspoken to return. He heard the faint sound of movement. A chair rolling, footsteps pausing, a cabinet creaking open in the kitchenette. Without thinking, Eli stood and followed, his legs moving before his mind could form an excuse. The kitchenette was bathed in soft golden light. Noah was already there, filling his water bottle, his expression neutral, tired maybe, but calm. Eli stepped in quietly, nodded, and went straight to the coffee machine, though he didn't really want anything. Noah didn't speak right away. He leaned against the counter again, the way he had before, as if this was routine. Maybe it was becoming one. Maybe they both needed this more than either had admitted. "It's quieter here at night," Noah said finally, his voice low and steady. Less pressure. Easier to think. Eli glanced at him. That simple observation carried a weight that felt familiar, as if it echoed something deep within him. He nodded once, but said nothing. They stood there a little longer, two shadows lingering under fluorescent lights. The hum of the fridge, an occasional ping from forgotten Slack notification, the only sound around them. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt necessary, like punctuation between breaths. Noah eventually broke it again, softer this time. "Do you ever feel like this place understands you more than people do?" Eli turned to him, caught off guard not by the words, but by how true they felt. His throat tightened. He thought of all the nights Head spent alone, buried in syntax, because the outside world demanded too much clarity and confidence. Code never asked personal questions. It never judged what he wasn't ready to share. "I guess it's easier to be understood by logic," he replied quietly, voice rough from disuse. "People are less predictable." Noah gave a soft huff of agreement. Not a laugh. More like a sigh that carried years of shared experience neither of them had spoken aloud. Neither of them asked why the other stayed so late. They didn't need to. Eli found himself sitting at one of the lounge chairs near the wide office windows, coffee cooling in his hands. To his surprise, Noah joined him. No explanation. No need for one. They just sat, both staring out at the glowing skyline as the rain returned, tapping softly against the glass. The world outside blurred into watercolor streaks of orange and gray. "I used to think working late made me more productive," Noah said eventually. "Now I think I just don't like going home." There it was, an admission. Honest, unvarnished. It hovered between them, vulnerable and real. Eli didn't respond, not because he didn't care, but because he understood. Too well. Instead, he nodded and let his silence speak for him. He thought about the things he never said, about the parts of himself that stayed locked away in quiet compartments, about the fact that he'd never told anyone at work he was gay. Not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't trust the world with that piece of himself. Not after how many times it had fractured in someone else's hands. And yet, sitting there beside Noah, watching the city sleep, he felt less guarded. Not safe, exactly, but not invisible either. Noah didn't push. He didn't prod or question. He just was present, open, quiet in all the ways Eli needed someone to be. The rain continued, gentle and rhythmic. Time passed unnoticed. Eventually, Noah stood and stretched, casting a glance at Eli before walking back toward his desk. Eli remained seated, staring into the shadows of the city, something in his chest aching in a way that wasn't painful, just unfamiliar. He didn't know what this was between them. He wasn't even sure if it was anything. But it was beginning to feel like the kind of quiet that asked to be heard, not solved. The kind that didn't demand action, just attention. When he finally returned to his desk, he felt lighter somehow. Not because anything had changed, but because, for once, he hadn't hidden. And in a world built on silence, that small act felt revolutionary. Another evening settled over the city, and once again the office slowly emptied, like sand slipping through fingers. Monitors dimmed, chairs were tucked in, and doors clicked shut one by one. By the time the last voice faded into the elevator shaft, only two quiet figures remained. Eli didn't question it anymore. Why he stayed, why Noah stayed. There was an unspoken rhythm to it now, like lines of code running in parallel, separate but quietly synchronized. He didn't make his way toward Noah that night. Instead, he waited. He typed without focus, rereading the same function again and again, fingers resting over keys while his mind wandered. Eventually, footsteps approached, not hurried, not hesitant, just present. Noah said nothing as he pulled a chair to Eli's desk and sat beside him, their elbows not quite touching. The room was dim except for the faint blue light from the screens and the orange glow of the city beyond the glass. It painted long shadows across their faces, softening the lines between tension and comfort. Eli glanced at him, uncertain what had brought Noah so close this time. But Noah didn't seem to be performing a gesture. He was simply there, as if the space beside Eli had always been meant for him. They both stared at the monitor for a while. The screen displayed a simple interface mock-up, unfinished, clean, and unremarkable. Yet somehow it became the backdrop to something unspoken. Noah shifted slightly in his seat, exhaled through his nose. Not tired, not impatient. Just real. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause. His voice barely carried. About how most of the time, people don't really see each other. Not fully. Eli didn't respond. He couldn't, not right away. The words settled over him, heavy and precise. He had spent years moving through life half-lit, keeping the softer parts of himself in shadow, convinced no one wanted to look closely enough to notice. Until now, something in Noah's presence felt like still water, quiet, reflective, capable of seeing beneath the surface without disturbing it. The silence returned, this time fuller. Not empty, but charged. Eli could feel the distance between them narrowing, not physically, but emotionally, as if some internal layer was slowly being peeled back, breath by breath. He glanced down at his hands, thumbs brushing one another in thought. He remembered moments in his past where he'd almost opened up to someone. Almost, but stopped short, afraid the truth would be too much or not enough. He'd never even told anyone in the office. Not about who he was. Not about the long relationship that ended 5 years ago. Not about how much it still haunted him in small, invisible ways. But with Noah sitting there, warm and real in the soft light, it didn't feel dangerous to think about sharing. It felt necessary. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he stood slowly, nodding toward the far end of the office, the common area with worn couches and wide windows that faced the heart of the city. Noah followed without a word. They sat together, knees angled slightly inward, gazes fixed ahead. It was late enough that the windows became mirrors, reflecting faint outlines of their faces alongside the endless city lights. "I used to come here even when the office was full," Eli said quietly, surprised by his own voice. "When it got too loud. Not with sound. With people." Noah looked at him with something like understanding in his eyes. Not pity, not curiosity. Just recognition. Eli continued, his voice steadier now. "I don't like being seen, unless it's by someone who knows how to look." Noah didn't reply. He didn't have to. There was no need to validate something already known. The stillness between them grew thick, not with tension, but anticipation. Like standing at the edge of a page just before it's turned. They didn't touch. They didn't move closer. But the air felt warmer somehow, more personal. Eli felt the weight of vulnerability pressing against his ribs like an ache. And yet, for once, he didn't recoil from it. He let stay. He turned his head slightly. Noah was already looking at him. No smiles. No words. just a gaze that felt like a whisper, soft, reverent, impossibly close to something unspoken. Eli looked away first, but not out of fear, only because he needed a moment to breathe. That night, they didn't say goodbye when they left the office. They simply walked to the elevator side by side, not touching, not speaking, just two men stepping into silence, no longer strangers to it. And when Eli got home, for the first time in years, he didn't turn on his laptop. He sat in the dark, thinking about the look in Noah's eyes, about how much could be said without speaking, and how sometimes silence was the loudest invitation of all. The office had become a second skin, a quiet place where time seemed to stretch and dissolve between late nights and dimmed lights. The world outside continued its rapid pulse, but within those glass walls, Eli found something slower, more deliberate, something that had begun to feel sacred. It was never planned. Neither of them sent messages or made promises. But night after night, as if guided by the same invisible rhythm, they both remained after hours. Sometimes their paths crossed in the kitchenette. Sometimes they found each other by the windows. More often now, they simply sat together in silence. Eli stopped wondering why Noah stayed. He stopped asking himself what he was waiting for. The answer wasn't in the lines of code or in the rain-smeared skyline. It was in the way he could breathe more easily when Noah was near. The way his chest didn't feel quite so heavy. The way stillness no longer felt lonely. One evening, after hours of quiet work broken only by the occasional shifting of chairs or soft clacking of keys, Eli stood and walked toward the far end of the office. Noah followed without needing to be asked. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The couch by the window welcomed them again. The city outside glowed gold and blue, traffic flowing like blood through veins, pulsing and endless. Inside, time seemed frozen. Eli stared at the skyline, then slowly turned his attention to Noah beside him. His face was calm, his shoulders relaxed, and yet his eyes held something, an intensity that simmered just beneath the surface. Eli's voice came softly. Do you ever feel like the most honest things are the ones we never say? Noah didn't reply immediately. He kept his gaze forward, thoughtful. Then quietly he nodded. That small gesture held more meaning than words could carry. The silence between them had evolved. It was no longer a lack of speech. It was a space held open for truth. A space where neither of them had to perform or pretend. Eli shifted, resting one arm along the back of the couch, his fingers just inches away from Noah's shoulder. He wasn't sure why he did it. Perhaps it was an invitation, or perhaps it was simply the need to feel a little closer to something real. The distance between them now was barely a breath, and yet it felt as vast and trembling as a heartbeat before confession. Eli didn't know what this connection was. Friendship, perhaps, or something else. Something still unformed, but present. It moved between them like static in the air, subtle, electric, waiting. Noah turned his head slightly, his gaze catching Eli's. For a long, quiet moment, neither looked away. There was no declaration, no confession, only the weight of mutual understanding, the recognition of something that didn't need to be named to be real. Eli felt it then, that pull, not of attraction in the traditional sense, but of gravity, of being seen, of being allowed to exist without defenses. And so, slowly, cautiously, he allowed himself to lean closer, not enough to close the space between them, but enough to feel its warmth. Noah didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply remained, his expression open, unreadable but grounded. His presence alone was a permission. Outside, the sky deepened to indigo. Lights flickered in the buildings across the skyline. A plane crossed in the distance, a small reminder that the world was still turning, unaware of the quiet revelation unfolding in a darkened office. Eli's heart beat louder now, not with fear, but with clarity. He wasn't imagining this. It wasn't one-sided. This quiet current between them had a rhythm of its own, a code neither of them had spoken, but both had written line by line in the silence. Their hands remained close, still not touching. The moment hung between them like a single note held in suspension, fragile, deliberate, endless. Eventually, Noah looked down at their hands. His expression shifted, not toward a decision, but toward acceptance. His fingers moved slightly, not enough to bridge the gap, but enough to acknowledge it. Eli felt the weight of that gesture like a hand on his chest. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But in that moment, something shifted. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything unspoken. And for Eli, that was enough. He leaned back against the couch, his breath steady, his chest lighter. Noah remained beside him, unmoving but present, like a star holding its place in the sky. They stayed that way as the night deepened, saying nothing, yet feeling everything. And in the space between their words, something honest began to take root. The night was fading slowly into a pale gray morning. Eli remained at his desk, though his work was long forgotten. Code blinked on the screen in static silence, untouched for hours. The office felt even more still than usual, as if it, too, had been holding its breath through the long, quiet hours they had shared. He glanced toward the far corner. Noah wasn't at his desk, but he hadn't left. They had migrated again to the couch by the window, not out of habit, but because the silence there felt more natural. It had become a kind of sanctuary, untouched by the noise of the day. There, unburdened by expectation, they could simply be. Now, as morning crept in, they sat side by side once more. No words had passed between them for a while, yet the air was rich with presence. Not tension, something deeper, something softer, familiar now. Outside, the first hints of sunlight traced the edges of the buildings. Golden lines sketched across rooftops and windows, brushing the city awake. Eli watched the sky slowly change. It felt like a quiet metaphor for everything that had unfolded between them. Gradual, delicate, real. He thought back over the nights before. The quiet moments. The not-quite touches. The things that hadn't been said, but had been understood. Somewhere along the way, without planning or speaking aloud, something had taken shape. He had not imagined it. He could feel it in the way his chest didn't tighten around Noah anymore, but expanded. In the way the silence no longer pressed in, but supported. In the way even now, neither of them had moved away. Noah sat with one leg drawn up on the couch, arms resting loosely on his knees. His gaze followed the soft blur of headlights below, eyes thoughtful but calm. He hadn't spoken in almost 20 minutes, yet Eli felt as if he'd been listening to him the whole time. And then, softly, Noah said, "I don't know where this leads." The words were simple, unpolished, honest. Eli didn't answer immediately. He watched the light spill slowly over the office floor, illuminating the shape of things. He thought about the versions of himself he'd buried in silence over the years, the emotional drafts left unreleased. This wasn't a confession. It wasn't a question. It was a moment, an invitation to breathe in the uncertainty together. "I don't either," Eli said after a pause. "But it doesn't feel like something I want to ignore." He didn't look at Noah as he spoke. The words felt too real for eye contact. But he could feel the shift beside him. A release, a small exhale, like the body settling into something it had been resisting. There was no promise made, no plan formed, only a quiet decision to let this be whatever it needed to be. Eventually, they both stood and made their way back to the main floor. The office lights had begun their automatic cycle, flickering to life as the sensors detected movement. But even in the light, the fragile calm of night clung to them like a shared secret. At the elevators, they paused. Noah didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. They simply exchanged a glance, steady, wordless, a touch of the eyes that said, "I see you. I understand. I'm here." And then they stepped out into the day, together but separate. In the days that followed, they resumed their routines. Meetings, deadlines, keyboard clatter, and passing conversations. To the rest of the office, nothing had changed. But Eli carried something with him now, a memory that lived not in grand gestures, but in the quiet. The shared chair, the late-night silence, the space that held what couldn't be named. He didn't try to label it. He didn't need to, because he knew what it meant when Noah lingered a second longer at the coffee machine. when their eyes met across a conference table and held just a beat too long, when, once in a while, they would sit quietly in the same space after hours, not as co-workers, but as something more human, not lovers, not even quite friends yet, but something, and maybe that something was enough. In the stillness of early evenings, Eli sometimes returned to the couch alone. He would sit with the city stretching out before him, recalling the warmth of presence that once sat beside him. He never tried to force it again, never chased it. What they shared wasn't something to recreate on command. It was born of stillness, of timing, of two people meeting not just in space, but in need. And as spring pushed its way through the concrete edges of the city, Eli found himself smiling more easily, breathing more deeply, remembering that connection didn't always arrive in declarations. It arrived in gestures, in patience, in the space between words. What stayed with him after sunrise wasn't a moment or a promise. It was the feeling of having been seen and having seen someone in return. And in that recognition, a quiet part of him had come back to life.